It's fair to say that the US and Ukraine have experienced a lot of ups and downs since Donald Trump began his second stint as US president. Trump had clashed with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky several times. At one point, the US even ceased all military aid to Ukraine, a move that was later reversed, and Trump had even labeled Zelensky a dictator in the past. Russian President Vladimir Putin must have been rubbing his hands in glee, thinking he had manipulated the US into withdrawing its support of Ukraine. He was wrong. The US is officially back in the game, and it's ready to help Ukraine obliterate Russia. And it all comes down to something that Trump prides himself on creating: a deal. On April 30, the BBC was among the first outlets to report that the US and Ukraine have finally signed a deal to share the profits from Ukraine's vast mineral and energy reserves. That deal was a long time in the making. Trump initially tabled the offer several months ago as a means for the US to generate repayment of the money it had committed to Ukraine throughout Putin's invasion. Initially, Trump wanted the deal to be so extensive that it would repay $500 billion to the US, which is significantly more than the $130 billion the Kiel Institute claims the US has delivered to Ukraine, without forcing the US to provide any security guarantees to Ukraine. Zelensky refused that version of the deal. He's also rumored to have refused other versions, such as deals that would give the US full control and rights over Ukraine's minerals. And he was right to do so. The deal Ukraine just signed with the US is far better for Ukraine than anybody could have hoped for. The BBC says that months of tense negotiations have resulted in a deal that provides a distinct financial incentive for the US to continue its support of Ukraine, both today and in the future. Details about the deal remain limited. What's clear is that it doesn't give the US full control over Ukraine's minerals and rare materials. Instead, the US is preparing to set up an investment fund into which it will contribute to aid Ukraine's recovery after it successfully fends off Putin's invasion. That fund is a statement of intent from the US. Its existence tells Putin that the US is backing Ukraine over the long haul and is going to put its money where its collective mouth is. More of America's renewed support for Ukraine can be seen in the language used to announce the deal. The US refers to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, seemingly placing the blame for the entire war at Putin's feet. That's huge in its own right. Trump has previously suggested that Zelensky was as much to blame for the fighting in Ukraine as Putin, even going as far to say in mid-April,
"You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles."
The US has also made it clear that Russia will in no way benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine and, by extension, the utilization of the vast mineral resources that lie within the country's territory. No state or person who financed or supplied the Russian war machine will be allowed to benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine, the US statement read. Again, that's a message to Russia. The US stands with Ukraine. Putin is being left out in the cold. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko, revealed more details about the deal, revealing it's far more beneficial to Ukraine than any deal previously proposed. How so? Well, for one thing, it's a true 50-50 deal, Sviridenko says, and it's structured in a way that it can attract global investment into our country. That's another major blow to Putin. Global investment clearly doesn't include Russia or any of its supporters, as the US statement outlines. That means the US is not only going to be investing in Ukraine, but it's also going to open up opportunities for Ukraine's other partners to do the same. Ukraine's ties to those who have supported it for the last 3 years are only going to grow strong. Putin can do nothing but sit back, watch, and seethe in response. Crucially, says the BBC, the new version of the deal, which is yet to be ratified by Ukraine but appears almost certain to be approved, delivers something Ukraine desperately wants from the US: security guarantees in return for natural resources. The fact that Ukraine has received those guarantees, in addition to a 50-50 partnership, is yet more evidence that the tide of opinion toward Ukraine in the US has shifted. Of course, there are still issues to overcome. The US and Ukraine need to hash out the governance of the funds, along with some issues related to transparency and the traceability of the funds invested in Ukraine. But those are minor quibbles. The bulk of the deal is in place. Both the US and Ukraine seem to be happy with it to the point where they've both signed technical documents. Putin just lost out big. To understand why, it's worth digging deeper into the mineral potential Ukraine holds. According to The Independent, Ukraine is home to at least 37 critical mineral deposits throughout the country. Those minerals include lithium, which is used for a huge number of modern electronic products, graphite and titanium. Right now, around 19% of those deposits, amounting to 7 out of the 37, are in Ukrainian territory that Russia holds. Those minerals are valuable. That's why Putin wants them. Estimates suggest that Ukraine may be sitting on as much as $16 trillion worth of mineral resources, including rare earth elements, and those resources stretch much further than the three mentioned so far. Ukraine is home to neodymium, which is a mineral used in the creation of wind turbines and batteries for electric vehicles. It possesses cerium and lanthanum, both of which are used in lighting and television production. There's also plenty of yttrium and erbium in Ukraine. Both have applications that extend to developing lasers and building nuclear power facilities. Many of these resources are still untapped. Ukraine has been trying to tap them. Before Putin's invasion, Zelensky offered opportunities to outside investors, including investment rights and tax breaks that could come into Ukraine to help it mine these minerals. Those efforts barely got off the ground. Russia's February 2022 invasion put a stop to them, with Ukraine being left with no options to reinvigorate investment while it's fighting. Still, Zelensky knew how vital a role Ukraine's minerals could play in his war plans. When he introduced his plan for victory in 2024, the mining of Ukraine's minerals was key among his goals. Putin knows precisely why. Though Russia's leader talks a lot about how his goal in Ukraine is to reintegrate a country that could never have been a sovereign nation into Russia, the reality is that he wants the country's minerals. How is that clear? Well, just look at where Russia focuses its invasion efforts. Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia have all been key targets for Russia since Putin's initial Ukraine invasion failed. Right now, the majority of the 20% of Ukrainian territory Russia holds is spread across those three regions. That isn't a coincidence. Putin will claim the reason is that Luhansk and Donetsk are already essentially Russian states. But he can't hide from the fact that the territory he's occupied means that Russia currently controls trillions of dollars worth of mineral reserves Ukraine is believed to have. It was never about the territory for Putin. It was all about the money. With a mineral deal now in place between the US and Ukraine, Putin sees a future where the trillions of dollars his land grabs could have delivered to Russia is slipping through his fingers. Russia's leader is getting desperate. Perhaps that's why he started proposing ceasefires, including a 3-day break in fighting to coincide with Russia's May 8 to May 11 celebrations of its World War II victory. Putin knows he needs a break to reassess, reinforce, and figure out how he will counter a resurgent Ukraine. Zelensky likely isn't going to grant Putin that break, especially now that he has such solid backing from the US. Another aspect of this new deal hasn't been fully explored yet, one that's massive for Ukraine from a defensive standpoint. Ukraine's new deal has already been noted for providing security guarantees and opening up plenty of investment opportunities for Ukraine's other key defense partners. But there was something else about the deal that a Ukrainian official mentioned that almost slipped under the radar. The official says that the US may also provide new assistance to Ukraine. That assistance could translate into something Ukraine desperately needs, according to Sky News: new air defense systems. That's huge for Ukraine, not least because air defense systems are something that Zelensky has called for throughout Putin's invasion. He's already pushed Ukraine's partners to deliver more of them at several points during 2024 and 2025. For instance, April of last year saw Zelensky comment on a US decision to grant another $61 billion in aid to Ukraine by noting where that aid needed to go. This year, Russian jets have already used more than 9,000 guided aerial bombs against Ukraine, and we need the ability to shoot down the air combat aircraft so that they don't approach our positions and borders, Zelensky commented at the time. Several things have changed for Ukraine since then. It has access to F-16s now, the first of which arrived in the country in August 2024. Ukraine also has permission from its US and UK allies to use their long-range missiles on Russian territory. Both can help Ukraine to strengthen its air defenses. However, neither is enough, as Zelensky revealed in April 2025. Posting to the social media site Telegram, Zelensky implored the US to provide Ukraine with more anti-air defenses. And when we turn to our partners, especially the United States for Patriot systems, we're asking for the kind of protection every nation deserves, Zelensky said. The plea came just hours after a Russian missile attack struck a residential high-rise building in Kharkiv, killing one man and injuring another 102 people, including 8 children. Just prior to that attack, Zelensky claimed that Ukraine was ready to buy 10 Patriot systems from the US for $15 billion. The US refused. At the time, it seemed like the refusal was a sign that the US may have been preparing to withdraw support for Ukraine. Why else would it say that it didn't want to receive money for weapon systems it wasn't using? Now, with this new investment deal on the table, the picture seems clearer. If the Ukrainian official is correct about the deal opening the way for Ukraine to get more aerial defenses from the US, the initial refusal may have just been the US holding off until the deal was made. It's important to stress how important these types of defensive weapons are for Ukraine. Zelensky hinted at it in April 2024 when noting that Russia had dropped 9,000 of its glide bombs on Ukraine in less than 4 months, expanding the scope to cover the majority of Putin's invasion. Missile, drone and bomb attacks are almost an everyday occurrence in Ukraine. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, offers more details. It maintains a daily tally of attempted Russian missile strikes against Ukraine dating from October 1, 2022 up to April 6, 2025. It shows a constant and consistent uptick in Russia's missile attacks since the beginning of Putin's invasion. From the end of 2022 up to April 2023, Russia's attacks typically involve less than 10 missiles, with larger attacks in the 50 to 70 missile range being fairly infrequent. Fast forward to the same period in 2024 and into 2025, and Russia's aerial threat has grown substantially. The majority of its strikes now include at least 50 and offer closer to 100 missiles. In some cases, such as an attack on December 13, 2024, Russia fired close to 300 missiles at Ukraine in a single day. That's the scale of the threat Ukraine faces from Putin's aerial strategy. Russia's leader uses his massive missile and bomb strikes to batter Ukraine's defenses, opening the door for ground forces to launch their own attacks. With this new deal potentially delivering air defense systems to Ukraine, those strikes become less effective. Minimizing the impact of Russia's missiles allows Ukraine's troops to focus more intently on Russia's ground assaults, which ultimately leads to 2 things for Russia: less territory taken and more soldiers lost in the process. Even worse for Putin is that the US now has an incentive to deliver air defense systems to Ukraine. Previously, the US may have seen donations as yet another example of Ukraine taking without giving anything back in return. Now, the US has a reason to protect Ukraine beyond stemming the flow of Russian influence. The more territory Putin takes, the less access the US has to the Ukrainian minerals from which it wants to profit. Again, it comes down to money. Only this time, Putin has to deal with the fact that the US wants a share of the pie and is willing to stand against him once again to get it. So, Russia is in a very bad place right now. The US has issued its strongest reaffirmation of support for Ukraine since President Trump took office. Here's why that's terrible news for Putin. Some of the reasons have already been covered, including the strengthening of Ukraine's defenses and Putin's potential loss of access to minerals he desperately wants. However, he also has to face up to the fact that the US is once again fully committed to something he wants to strip away: Ukraine's status as a sovereign nation. As mentioned before, Putin has often claimed that Ukraine isn't a country. He's even used that line of reasoning to justify Russia's invasion. For instance, July 2021 saw Putin, or more likely one of his ghostwriters, publish a 5,000-word missive to the Kremlin website. In that essay, Putin asserted that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. The University of Rochester also points out that Putin believes Russians and Ukrainians have a common heritage, also shared by Belarus, that stems from a realm known as Kievan Rus. Existing between 862 and 1242, this loose medieval political federation seems to lie at the heart of Putin's historical justification for invading Ukraine. The claim is tenuous at best. Putin is trying to use ancient history to justify his occupation. How far can that argument possibly stretch? Europe in particular has changed massively over the last 2,000 years. The United States didn't even exist, at least in its current form, at the same time as Kievan Rus. Still, Putin uses arguments like these to claim that Ukraine isn't a sovereign nation. The US just spat in the face of those arguments with its new minerals deal, and that's bound to make Putin fume. Why? Because he believed that he was doing a good job at manipulating US leadership into giving him what he wanted out of his Ukraine invasion. Ukraine has understood Putin's plan from the start. In January, mere weeks into Trump's second tenure as US president, Zelensky said that Putin wants to manipulate the desire of the President of the United States of America to achieve peace. At the time, Zelensky claimed he was confident that these manipulations wouldn't work. But the reality is that US and Ukrainian relationships have been on shaky ground for much of 2025. Earlier this year, the US withdrew military aid, with Trump even accusing Zelensky of being a dictator at one point. More recently, Putin's machinations appeared to be manifesting in an alleged US peace proposal that would have seen Ukraine officially handing Crimea over to Russia. Zelensky would never have accepted such a proposal, but that almost didn't matter to Putin. The fact that he seemed to be convincing the US to consider actions that would harm Ukraine was enough to tell him that he had his tendrils in the US leadership. The announcement of the new deal between Ukraine and the US reveals that he doesn't have that influence anymore. Perhaps he never did, and that will be a huge shock to Putin's system as he continues his push in Ukraine. In the past, US involvement was limited to providing aid and training to Ukraine. Now, the minerals deal promises to deliver something to Ukraine that it hasn't had before, something that Putin fears: American personnel in Ukraine. Of course, the US isn't going to commit any of its soldiers to fight in Ukraine. However, investing as heavily into the country as it's promising to do means that it'll be sending many people. Think contractors, some potentially involved with the US military, and companies that are capable of helping Ukraine access its massive mineral deposits. What do you think would happen if Russia attacked the regions where those US personnel are working? Putin would face America's wrath. And therein lies a secondary security guarantee to go along with the promises of investment and future aerial defenses. Ukraine has played its hand brilliantly to secure a US presence in its country, making it much harder for Putin to continue his invasion plans without directly attacking the American people. The risks attached to the Ukraine invasion have just skyrocketed for Putin. One false move could lead to American deaths. Those deaths would lead to an even stronger push from the US and Ukraine's other allies to expel Russia from Ukraine. Sure, the US is getting something in return. Access to half of $12 trillion in mineral reserves is nothing to sneeze at. But it may just be offering something more valuable to Ukraine than the billions of dollars in military aid it sent over during the war now that the minerals deal is in place. The US may have just made it so that Putin can't attack the areas of Ukraine on which it hoped to focus in 2025 and beyond. Perhaps this was Trump's plan all along. He'd made plenty of grandiose statements about ending the Ukraine war before he became president, and it was never quite clear how he intended to do it. As Sky News correspondent David Blevin so aptly puts it, Mr. Trump vowed to end the war in Ukraine on his first day in office. On his 101st day, he's closer to doing that than he's ever been before. But what do you think about the new deal between Ukraine and the US? Have we just seen the first step into a war-ending scenario that leaves Putin with nothing to show for over 3 years of fighting? How will Russia change its approach to Ukraine now that the US is back in the game and on Ukraine's side? Let us know your thoughts below, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest events in the Ukraine war.